I was driving home at about 1 to 2 a.m., coming home from a board game night at a friend's place that had run really late. They lived in a rural area, so it was a long and lonely drive home. There were 3 odd things that happened in quick succession. The first was that I drove into a heavy bank of fog. The fog wasn't even that uncommon in the area, but it was only in mornings and never after midnight. This area wasn't close to the ocean or something, and there was no wind, so it couldn't have blown in from somewhere else. Weird, but not unexplainable or scary. I reduced my speed so the car was only doing 40 or so and continued on. Eventually, I drove out of it. The second was that I came upon a huge tree that was on fire, completely engulfed, had to be at least 3 stories tall. It was a fair way down the road, and there was nobody I could see around it. Sometimes people burn out old trees, but why would they do it at 2 a.m.? There had been no storm, so it couldn't have been a lightning strike. The weirdest thing about it was that it felt strange looking at it, like it was some kind of portent or omen. I'm not a religious or superstitious person, but looking at this tree, I can't even explain the feeling, like something important was happening or coming. But I drove on. Then I came upon a section of road that was undergoing maintenance. It's not unusual to see crews working on roads all hours of the night, but in this case there was no crew. I slowed down and stopped because there was a sign up saying to wait for directions. There were a half-dozen trucks with lights flashing, windows down. One of those small bobcat things with a scoop on the front like a miniature bulldozer. Even a radio playing somewhere, even though I couldn't see it. The scene is burned into my brain 5 years later. The song American Pie was playing on the radio. Suddenly I was afraid. More afraid than I had ever been before or since. I have been bitten by a deadly snake miles from help, had a gun pointed at me by a schizophrenic, seen my sister nearly fall off a cliff. But never in my life have I been as afraid as I was in that moment. It was like I was actually having trouble catching my breath. It was flat ground in every direction. Even if these dozens of men had decided to hide as some sort of prank, there was nowhere for them to go. Then suddenly the song kind of skipped on the lyrics. The jester stole his thorny crown. Except it wasn't like the same section of the song was just playing again. It was more like time was skipping. I don't even know how to explain this. Suddenly I realized that something terrible was about to happen to me. Probably the same thing that happened to the road crew. So I punched the gas, foot straight to the floor. For 2 long seconds, nothing happened. The car didn't even move, despite being in drive and the engine running. Then the sudden acceleration started and I was pushed back in my seat, almost sideswiping some of the trucks. I drove at an unsafe speed for about another 15 minutes and the feeling of danger was gone. Then I pulled over and cried my eyes out. I was actually obsessed about it for years afterwards. The weather reports didn't record any fog. I posted on Facebook groups in the area asking if anyone else had seen it, but nobody said they had. I drove the route a week later in daylight looking for the charred remains of the tree, but could never find anything. Even if it had burnt to the ground, there still should have been a patch of dead grass. I called up the Department of Main Roads and asked them how long the work on the particular stretch of road would be continuing, only to have them tell me that the last maintenance they had done in that area was 7 years ago, and not in the section I described. When I went back to look for the tree, I could see no evidence of any fresh repairs. In fact, there were several potholes, and that is usually the first thing to be fixed. I actually ended up going to see a psych about it. I was worried I had experienced some kind of adult-onset mental illness. He couldn't seem to find anything wrong with me. So I never got any answers. I was driving home through back roads I had never actually been on and came across a bookstore in a tiny town in the woods. The store was actually a house, where the front of the home had been converted into a store. There was a box on the porch that said 50-cent books, so I stopped to see if there was any Stephen King books in there. A middle-aged woman comes out with a huge smile and gives me a bowl of fruit and some tea. I'm like, this place is awesome, and rifle through books while eating the fruit and downing the tea. Inside the store/home, there were a lot of cool art books and stuff, so I spent some more time in there. She brought me more tea. Even when I said no thank you, that's plenty, she kept refilling. Gave me dessert too, brownies and cookies. I didn't realize it at the time, but she was drugging me. It's hazy to remember the details, but at some point she closed the shop, telling me to take my time looking at books. She told me that she was going to take a shower and was gone for a while. When I was ready to pay, I had to wander back through the house to find her. I found her in her bedroom. She was in bed. Pretty sure she was naked. At the time, I thought, weird, she's watching an exercise video in bed, but later realized she was watching porn. You might think, oh, this is hot, but it isn't. She was my mom's age and had been telling me how she reminded me of her kids in college. So not hot. Also the part about you being drugged, that also kind of ruins it, I think. I told her I was ready to pay, and she told me to open the register, so I went and opened it, put what I thought I owed, took out the change, and left. When I stumbled outside, a fire engine drove by, screaming with sirens. In the distance was the glow of a big forest fire, and the stars were being covered by smoke. A tall man on a horse watched the fire truck pass. He looked right at me, took a piece of wood or something out of his mouth, and said, "Town's burning." I swear to God, I have a crystal clear memory of this happening, even though I'm sure it couldn't have. By this point, I guess I was seriously tripping on something. I'm not a drug guy, so I don't know what I had, but I was out of my mind and could hardly walk. I got back in my car and drove home along twisting roads on tall cliffs above the ocean. Twice I realized I was on the wrong side of the road. One of the times I realized this because a massive truck was headed straight for me, laying on the horn and flashing its lights. I kept thinking about how my car could be like an airplane and a submarine if I drove it off the cliff. I can't believe I made it home alive. Later, I realized I was in that house for about 4 hours looking at books. At least that's what I hoped to hell I was doing. A friend and I were hiking in the woods. He was at the camp and went back to check on things about a half-mile away. Suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch, the woods became silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, no birds. Just the most eerie silence I have ever experienced. After a few minutes, it was suddenly back to normal forest noises. Thinking I must have had a seizure or temporary deafness or something, I hurried back to camp only to see my friend standing there with a confused or scared look on his face. I must have had a similar look because he immediately asked if I had heard the silence. We tried to come up with an explanation, but absolute silence in the woods seems impossible, even more so that it was so sudden.